We think of Vikings as fearless warriors, sailing the seas in search of glory and gold, but what rarely gets spoken of is what happened after the raids ended. When the swords stopped clashing and the fires went out, that's when the true nightmare began. Not for the men who fought them, but for the women they took. What those women endured made death seem merciful, and the evidence, buried in bones and bloodlines across Europe, still whispers their story today. Make sure to subscribe. It helps us continue uncovering these hidden chapters of history, and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. We grow up hearing tales of Vikings as fearless explorers, bold seafarers who carved their destiny through icy winds and open seas. They are remembered as traders, warriors and adventurers who brought Europe into a new age of expansion. But behind that image of glory lies a shadow almost never told in classrooms or history. Books, the same longships that carried warriors also, carried the screams of the captured. Because when the raids ended, when the villages were silent and the fires still glowed, the Vikings didn't just take gold, they took people. Early medieval chronicle, like the Annals of Ulster and the Anglo-Saxon, chronicle mention these abductions only in passing. A line here, a brief lament there, as if the suffering of the taken was too common to describe. But what those chroniclers could not, or dared not write, is now being revealed through modern science. Archaeologists and geneticists have traced the silent evidence buried beneath centuries of soil and bone. DNA pulled from ancient graves in Iceland, Norway, and the British Isles tells a story the sagas never confessed. They did not only raid, they reshaped the genetic map of Europe. This was not just conquest by sword, but by bloodline. The year was 793 AD, when sails appeared on the horizon near Lindisfarne, a small monastery off the coast of northern England. What followed would echo through all of Christian Europe. The monks described the attackers as dragons from the sea. They came with fire, steel, and fury. And when they left, they took everything that could be carried: gold, relics, livestock, and people. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Within decades, Viking longships spread like storms across Britain, Ireland, and the coasts of France. But not every raid was for treasure. Some were carefully chosen for what they could supply, not in silver, but in flesh. Captured women became what Norse traders called moving wealth. They were chained, marched to ports, and loaded aboard ships bound for markets far from home. Places like Dublin, Hedeby, and Burka became centres of a hidden economy, one built on human lives. Arab chroniclers such as Ibn Fadlan and Al-Tartushi left some of the most vivid accounts of this trade. They described Viking merchants arriving along the Volga River, offering slaves to buyers from the Islamic world. According to their words, the markets were filled with women and children captured from the Western lands. To the Vikings, it was business. To their captives, it was the end of one world and the beginning of another they could never escape. Centuries later, the earth itself began to speak. Beneath old Viking settlements in Dublin, York, and Gotland, archaeologists unearthed the quiet remains of a brutal trade. Rusted iron shackles, corroded chains, and trade weights lay buried beside household tools, the unmistakable instruments of transport and exchange. They weren't used for livestock, they were sized for people. At first, these findings were treated as isolated curiosities, but when DNA analysis began to link these sites together, the story became undeniable. Teams from the University of Iceland and the University of Oslo studied the genetic patterns of modern Scandinavian populations and found something astonishing. The Y chromosomes, passed from father to son, were overwhelmingly Norse, but the mitochondrial DNA inherited from mothers told another story entirely. In Iceland, for example, 60% of female ancestry traces back to Celtic women, while only 40% originates from Norse males. In simple terms, the men who founded Iceland were Vikings, the women were not. This imbalance could not have happened by chance. It is the biological shadow of large-scale capture, coercion, and forced integration, the genetic echo of raids that reached across the North Atlantic. Every cell, every strand of DNA became a silent witness to what the chronicles refused to write. For the women who survived the raids, captivity was not a single event, it was a lifetime. In Norse society, enslaved people were known as thralls, the lowest rung of a world built on hierarchy and strength. Female thralls worked wherever labor was needed. They washed, cooked, harvested, and served in silence inside the homes of the very men who had taken them. But their bodies carried another, darker expectation. Many were forced to become concubines, used to satisfy or expand the households of their captors. The sagas rarely name them, yet in the margins of stories like the Laxdæla saga and Egil's saga, faint traces of their reality appear. A woman taken in Ireland, another gifted by the Sea King, or a servant of foreign tongue. Each phrase hides what we now understand, that many of these women were not companions by choice, but prisoners made invisible by time. Some bore children who inherited their father's status, technically free in law, but never free from the silence that defined their mother's life. Saga poets, forbidden to speak directly of such shame, used metaphors instead. They wrote of silent wives and weeping mothers, lines that, to modern ears, sound like mourning disguised as poetry. To live as a thrall was to exist in the shadow of someone else's freedom, to speak in a tongue no one cared to understand. Beneath the myth of adventure and glory, the Viking world ran on a quieter, colder currency. People. Human trafficking was not a side effect of raiding. It was a pillar of the Viking economy. Captured men, women, and children became the lifeblood of a trade network that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the markets of the Islamic world. They were exchanged for silver, wine, silk, and spices, luxuries that filled Norse halls and funded the construction of kingdoms. The city of Dublin, founded by Vikings in the 9th century, grew into one of the largest slave markets in northern Europe. Chroniclers described ships docking by the dozens, their cargo not always visible above deck. The air filled with the sounds of bargaining, not over grain or furs, but over human lives. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have unearthed thousands of Arab silver, dirhams, coins minted in places like Baghdad and Samarkand. But these coins didn't arrive through peaceful trade alone. Most were earned through the sale of people to foreign merchants along the Volga and Caspian routes. Excavations in Hedeby and Birka have even uncovered precisely calibrated bronze scales and silver weights, the tools of commerce. Their purpose was clear: to ensure every exchange was exact, every profit accounted for. Human beings were measured like metal, their worth determined by weight and demand. The Vikings sailed for glory, yes, but they returned with wealth built on the bodies of the conquered. The Vikings saw themselves as people of honor, guided by gods of courage, loyalty, and destiny. Odin, Thor, and Freya filled their stories with valor and vengeance. Their myths celebrated freedom, bravery, and the warrior's right to choose his fate. And yet, beneath that proud mythology, the same culture that praised heroism also permitted the enslavement of innocence. In legend, women could be shield maidens, fierce fighters standing shoulder to shoulder with men. But in life, most women taken in raids became thralls, stripped of name, voice, and freedom. The contradiction was staggering. The same sagas that sang of brave Valkyries also described women bought, sold, and silenced. The Viking legal code, known as Gragas, was explicit. It treated thralls not as humans, but as property, assets that could be inherited, traded, or even killed without legal consequence. A thrall's life was measured by their owner's will, not their own worth. Yet, not all stories end in cruelty. The sagas, in their fragmented honesty, hint at moments of humanity, brief cracks in the armor of conquest. Some thralls were eventually freed, and a few even married their captors, rising to positions of respect and wealth. But even those rare transformations could not erase the truth of how their story began. The Norse world was built on a paradox, a civilization that worshipped freedom while denying it to so many who lived among them. History often hides behind numbers, thousands taken, countless lost, but every statistic was once a person with a name, a heartbeat, a story. One such name survives in the Laxdæla saga, Melkorka. She was said to be an Irish princess, captured during a raid and sold as a slave in Iceland. For years, she pretended to be mute, refusing to speak the language of her captors, perhaps as the only act of resistance left to her. When her true identity was finally discovered, she was freed and became the mother of a nobleman, her bloodline merging with the very society that once enslaved her. Her story is part legend, part truth, but within it lies the echo of countless voices that never found release. Not all left behind a name. In the monastic records following the 793 Lindisfarne raid, one entry mentions a missing nun, taken north by sea. No chronicle ever mentions her again. Her silence represents thousands of women whose faith and vows offered no protection against the brutality of conquest. Archaeology adds its own testimony. In Birka, Sweden, excavations uncovered the grave of a woman buried with iron shackles placed beside her bones. The position and context suggested she may have lived as a slave, yet her burial was treated with care, her body laid in a way reserved for the respected dead. It was as if, in death, she was granted the dignity denied to her in life. Each of these fragments, a saga, a record, a grave, forms a mosaic of memory. They remind us that the Viking world was not only built by warriors and kings, but also by those who suffered in their shadow. Centuries after the last longship vanished over the horizon, the truth of what happened did not fade. It sank deeper, into the very blood of nations. Modern genetics has done what chronicles and sagas could not. It gave the voiceless their testimony. When researchers began sequencing mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down only from mothers, they found an unmistakable pattern. Across Iceland, Norway, and parts of Denmark, maternal lines traced not to Scandinavia, but to the British Isles. The data was staggering. From 2008 to 2022, multiple genetic studies mapped the spread of female ancestry against the known routes of Viking expansion, from Ireland to Iceland, from Scotland to Norway's western coast. The overlap was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. As geneticist Agnar Helgason of Decode Genetics put it, the Viking Age was not only a military expansion, it was also a reproductive conquest. The men who sailed north and west carried their swords. The women they took carried the next generation. Over time, the children born of these forced unions became citizens, farmers, even nobles, unaware that their lineage began in fear. Every family tree built in that era bore a silent fracture, a hidden line connecting freedom to captivity, conqueror to conquered. And though the sagas never spoke their names, the DNA did. Each strand whispered the same story, that the Viking Age never truly ended. It simply transformed into memory, carried inside the living. For centuries, history spoke only with a man's voice. When Christian chroniclers recorded the Viking Age, they softened its edges, turning raids into conversions and abductions into marriages. In their writings, the brutality vanished beneath scripture and moral order. The Norse sagas, written later, did no better. They glorified conquest, celebrated plunder, and painted raiders as heroes chasing honor across the seas. But between those lines, in the pauses where women should have spoken, there was silence. The women who endured capture, exile, and forced motherhood left no letters, no testimonies, no names. Their stories survived only in fragments, a verse of lament in an Icelandic poem, a broken comb found in a burial mound, a bone bearing the marks of childbirth and violence intertwined. It was archaeology, not literature, that finally gave them a voice. Excavations from Ireland to Orkney, from Norway to Iceland, uncovered graves that contradicted the myths, graves of foreign women buried far from home. Among the people who once took them, the earth itself became their final witness. Each unearthed skeleton whispered what the official annals refused to record, that beneath the songs of glory lay an empire built not just on trade and courage, but on abduction, silence, and the rewriting of truth. The Viking legacy has long been carved in images of longships, axes, and roaring warriors, but beneath that legend lies a quieter, darker inheritance. Every nation touched by Viking sails carries fragments of their journey, not just in language or legend, but in blood, in bones, in the unspoken memories passed down through generations. Modern genetic studies reveal what the sagas never confessed. The diversity of Scandinavia today is born as much from violence as from exploration, from women who were taken, from lives uprooted, from survival against all odds. As one historian observed, every heroic saga rests on someone else's silence, and that silence still echoes. It lives in the mitochondrial code of Icelanders, in the Celtic names found in Nordic ancestry, in the quiet dignity of graves once dug for the enslaved. Whether viewed through legend or science, one truth remains unshaken. The Viking Age's darkest legacy was not its battle, but what followed after. The forgotten voices of the taken still speak, not through words, but through the very fabric of who we are.